The email arrived at 7:14 on a Thursday morning, and it was from my company's HR director. And the subject line said, "Congratulations on your promotion recommendation." And it was addressed to my sister Claudia, and it had been sent to me by mistake because Claudia and I share the same last name and similar first initials. And someone in HR had selected the wrong contact from the dropdown. And the email said HR was pleased to confirm that Claudia Merritt had been formally recommended for the senior project manager role based on her leadership of the Alderton account over the past 18 months and her demonstrated ability to manage cross-functional teams under pressure. And I read that sentence 3 times sitting in my car in the parking garage before work, and I want to tell you what I felt in that parking garage, because it was not the simple, clean anger that people might expect. It was something more complicated than that, which was a very specific kind of grief that comes from recognizing a pattern you had been choosing not to fully see. And the Alderton account that HR was crediting to Claudia was the account I had spent 18 months building from a cold contact into the agency's most profitable relationship of the year, and Claudia had been on my team for 7 of those 18 months, and I had brought her in myself because she needed the experience, and I had trusted her because she was my sister. Hi everyone, welcome back. And if you're new here today, I genuinely think this is one of the more important stories I've told here because it's not really about a promotion. It's about what happens when you see something clearly for the first time that you had been almost seeing for a long time, and the email was the thing that made it fully visible. So stay with me. My name is Lauren Merritt, and I am 29 years old, and I work at a marketing agency as a project manager, and my sister Claudia is 26 and joined the same agency 14 months before any of this happened, when I recommended her for an entry-level position because she was between jobs and I believed in her abilities and wanted to help her build something. And I want to be honest up front that I loved my sister and still do. And this story is complicated by that love in ways that I am still working through. Claudia and I had always been close in the way that sisters who are 3 years apart can be close, which is intimately and sometimes competitively. And the competition had always been the undercurrent that we did not name directly. And I had learned to navigate it by staying genuinely in my own lane, meaning I focused on my work and my growth, and I did not compare my trajectory to hers, and I did not feel threatened by her successes. And I had believed, until the Thursday morning email, that she operated the same way toward me. And I want to be precise about when I started noticing things that I should have paid more attention to earlier because the HR email did not come out of nowhere. And I think the honest version of this story requires me to acknowledge the signals I had been gently choosing not to fully process. The signals had started approximately 8 months into Claudia's time on my team, and they were small enough individually that I had absorbed each one as a standalone rather than as part of a pattern. And they sounded like this. At a client dinner for the Alderton account, Claudia had mentioned a strategic recommendation to the client's director before I had a chance to present it myself, framing it as something she and I had been developing together when I had actually developed it alone the previous weekend. And I had let it go because the client liked the idea and the outcome was good, and I told myself it was collaborative spirit. And at an internal strategy meeting, Claudia had presented a timeline for the Alderton campaign that she had built directly from a document I had shared with her for reference, adding her name to the header and removing mine. And I had mentioned it to her privately, and she had said, "I thought you meant for me to take the lead on that one." And I had said, "I did not mean that, but okay." And at a team check-in 6 weeks before the email, Claudia had told our shared manager that the Alderton client had specifically requested her as the primary contact going forward, which was technically true, but had not included the context that the client had made that request after Claudia had spent 3 weeks positioning herself as the account lead in my absence during a week I was on approved leave. The email I received by mistake was the piece that connected all of those signals into a single coherent picture, and the picture was that Claudia had been systematically positioning herself as the architect of the Alderton account in the eyes of the people who made promotion decisions, and she had done it gradually and with the specific patience of someone who understood that sudden moves are more visible than slow ones. and I sat in the parking garage and I read the email 4 times. And then I did something I want to be honest about, which is that I forwarded it to my personal email address before I did anything else, because I understood in that parking garage that I was going to need this document and I was going to need it to be time-stamped and I was going to need it to exist somewhere that was not dependent on the company's server access. I went to work and I sat at my desk, and I did not say anything to Claudia, who sat 12 feet away from me. And I did not say anything to HR, and I did not say anything to my manager, and I answered my emails and attended my meetings. And at 6 p.m. I went home, and I called my friend Jasmine, who had worked in HR at a different company for 4 years, and I read her the email, and Jasmine said, "Lauren," and I said, "Yes," and she said, "That's your account," and I said, "Yes, it is." And she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I'm going to the family dinner on Sunday." And Jasmine said, "What?" And I said, "Our parents are hosting dinner Sunday, and Claudia is going to be there." And Jasmine said, "Lauren, that's not a plan." And I said, "It is a plan. Jasmine, it's just a patient one." The family dinner was at my parents' house, and it was a Sunday, and there were 6 of us at the table. My parents, my Aunt Carol, Claudia, my aunt's husband, and me. And Claudia had been in a visibly good mood all weekend, based on the group chat which I had been monitoring and not participating in. And at the dinner table, my mother said, "Claudia, you seem happy this weekend." And Claudia said, "I have some news, actually." And my father said, "Tell us." And Claudia said, "I'm being recommended for a promotion at work to senior project manager." And my mother said, "That's wonderful." And my father said, "We're so proud of you." And my Aunt Carol said, "What is that role?" And Claudia began to explain, and as she explained, she described the Alderton account as the primary basis for the recommendation, and she described it as her account, and she described the client relationship as something she had built from the ground up. And I listened to the whole explanation, and when she finished, I said, "Claudia, can I ask you something?" And she looked at me and said, "Of course." And I said, "Whose account is Alderton?" And the table went very quiet, and Claudia said, "It's mine." And I said, "I'd like to show everyone something." And I took out my phone, and I pulled up the original email from HR. And I said, "This was sent to me by mistake last Thursday," and I read it out loud, and when I finished, I said I brought the Alderton account in from a cold contact 18 months ago. I managed the relationship for 11 of those 18 months, and the strategic framework that HR is attributing to your leadership was built by me, and Claudia said, "Lauren," and I said, "I'm not angry, Claudia. I just want our parents to have accurate information about whose work is being recognized," and the table was completely silent. And my mother looked at Claudia for a long time, and then she looked at me and she said, "Lauren, I didn't know." And I said, "I know, Mom." And my father said, "Claudia, is this true?" And Claudia said, "It's more complicated than Lauren is making it sound." And I said, "Claudia, I have 18 months of emails, project files, and client correspondence that document exactly who built that account. Would you like me to go through them?" And Claudia said no. And the table was quiet again, and my Aunt Carol said, "I think we should have dessert," and someone passed the cake and we had dessert. Claudia and I have not spoken easily since that Sunday, and I want to be honest that this has been the hardest part. Not the promotion, not the credit, but the understanding that the person I brought into my workplace, because I trusted her, had spent 7 months carefully building a version of events that would benefit her at my direct expense. And I have sat with that for several months now, and I have not fully resolved it, and I do not think resolution is something that happens on a schedule. And what I have instead is clarity. And clarity is not comfortable, but it is more useful than the almost seeing. I was doing before the Thursday morning email, and the promotion recommendation for Claudia was reviewed by HR after I submitted a formal account history with documentation, and the outcome of that review is something I am keeping private because it belongs to my professional life and not to this story. But I will say that the Alderton client sent me a personal email 3 weeks after the dinner that said, "Lauren, we have always considered you our primary relationship here, and we want to make sure that is clear." And I saved that email next to the accidental HR one, and I think together they tell a more complete story than either one does alone.